Creation is not something that happens outside you. It happens through you. The moment the self stops creating, it begins repeating. And repetition keeps life alive. But creation gives it meaning. In Iqbal's vision, creation is the proof of an awakened self. Khudi does not merely endure existence. It shapes it through intention, will, and responsible action. To create is not escape from reality. It is participation in becoming. Today, we continue our journey through Asra'i Khudi, Allama Iqbal's philosophy of the self. This is episode 46. Remain attentive. Creation begins inwardly. Creation is not something that happens outside the self. It is something that happens through it. The self is not born complete. It is born capable of shaping reality. Through intention, through will, through action aligned with meaning. The self learns that creation begins inwardly. Before anything appears in the world, it appears as a movement within. A movement of vision. A movement of resolve. A movement of courage. The self understands that to create is not merely to produce. It is to imprint being upon existence. What the self creates carries its inner signature. The self realizes that a passive self consumes. A creative self contributes. Consumption exhausts. Contribution renews. The self sees that creation requires responsibility. What is created affects others. What affects others returns to the self. Creation is never neutral. The self learns that creativity is not talent alone. Talent without will stagnates. Will awakens talent and gives it direction. The self understands that creation demands risk. What already exists requires no courage. What does not yet exist demands faith in becoming. The self realizes that creation is an act of trust. Trust in one's vision. Trust in one's effort. Trust that meaning can be embodied. The self sees that creation distinguishes the living self from the surviving one. Survival repeats. Creation transforms. The self learns that to create is to resist inertia. Inertia pulls downward. Creation pushes forward. The self understands that creativity requires discipline. Without discipline, creation scatters. With discipline, creation endures. The self realizes that creation is not chaos. It is order emerging from intention. Order chosen consciously becomes culture, becomes history, becomes legacy. The self sees that the creative self does not imitate blindly. Imitation weakens individuality. Creation strengthens identity. The self learns That to create is to accept loneliness. Not everyone understands what has not yet taken form. Solitude becomes the price of originality. The self understands that creation is dialogue with reality. Reality resists. The self responds. Through this tension, new forms emerge. The self realizes that creation requires patience. What is rushed fractures. What is nurtured matures. The self sees that creation is not self-indulgence. It is service through form. Form gives meaning visibility. The self learns that the creative act anchors the self in time. Time does not merely pass. It becomes shaped. The self understands that creation stabilizes the self. A self that creates knows its direction. Direction reduces doubt. The self realizes that creation deepens responsibility. What is created must be carried. Carrying strengthens character. The self sees that creation reveals the self. To itself, one does not fully know who one is until one creates and witnesses what emerges. The self understands that creation is not reserved for the gifted. It is demanded of the awake. Awareness seeks expression. The self realizes that to suppress creation is to suppress vitality. Vitality denied turns inward and decays. The self sees that creation is the self's response to existence itself. Existence asks, "What will you add?" And the self begins to understand. To create is not to escape the world. It is to participate in its becoming. The self begins to understand that creation is not an addition to life. It is life expressed consciously. The self realizes that every conscious act is a creative act. To choose meaning over comfort is creation. To act with integrity in a fractured world is creation. The self understands that creation does not always appear as art. Sometimes it appears as courage. Sometimes as restraint. Sometimes as a life lived deliberately. When conformity would be easier, the self sees that the creative self does not wait for permission. Permission delays becoming. Creation requires initiative. The self learns that fear is the greatest enemy of creation. Fear seeks safety. Creation seeks truth. Truth demands exposure. The self understands that creation is not loud. It is precise. Precision emerges from clarity. Clarity grows from self-knowledge. The self realizes that the creative self must confront resistance. Resistance tests sincerity. Sincere intention persists. The self sees that creation demands endurance. What is new is always fragile at first. Fragility protected becomes strength. The self learns that creation organizes chaos. Chaos without vision overwhelms. Vision applied patiently produces order. The self understands that creation requires sacrifice. Sacrifice of comfort. Sacrifice of approval. Sacrifice of certainty. What remains is authenticity. The self realizes that the creative self cannot be rushed. Pressure distorts form. Time allows alignment. The self sees that creation requires solitude. Not isolation from humanity, but independence of thought. Thought unborrowed becomes original. The self learns that creation is a discipline of attention. Attention scattered produces noise. Attention focused produces meaning. The self understands that creation is not perfection. It is commitment to refinement. Refinement requires humility. Humility sustains growth. The self realizes that the creative self does not chase validation. Validation arrives late, if at all. Meaning must arrive first. The self sees that creation deepens individuality. Individuality expressed strengthens presence. Presence authentic attracts resonance. The self learns that the creative self must tolerate misunderstanding. Misunderstanding is temporary. Truth embodied endures. The self understands that creation is not control. It is cooperation with reality's resistance. Resistance shapes form. Form reveals intention. The self realizes that creativity requires trust in unseen outcomes. Outcomes uncertain. Test commitment. Commitment sustained reveals direction. The self sees that creation anchors the self in the present moment. Creation absorbs attention fully. Attention absorbed dissolves anxiety. The self learns that creation transforms energy. Energy undirected disperses. Energy directed builds structure. The self understands that creation strengthens moral courage. To create is to stand behind one's values. Values lived become visible. The self realizes that the creative self moves forward without guarantee. Guarantees belong to repetition. Creation belongs to faith. The self sees that creation is not escape from limitation. It is engagement with it. Limits provoke ingenuity. Ingenuity deepens strength. The self understands That creation shapes destiny quietly. Small acts of creation accumulate into influence, and the self begins to feel. Creation is not an option. It is the obligation of an awakened self. There comes a moment when the self understands that creation is not self-expression alone. It is self-responsibility. What the self creates enters the world and alters it. The self realizes that every act of creation is a declaration of belief. Belief about meaning. Belief about value. Belief about what deserves to exist. The self understands that creation reveals loyalty. What the self builds reveals what it serves. Service defines direction. Direction shapes destiny. The self sees that the creative self does not wait for perfect conditions. Conditions never become perfect. Creation begins with what is available. The self learns that creation matures the self. The self becomes larger than its fears when it dares to bring something new into existence. The self understands that creation demands accountability. Once created, the self cannot deny authorship. Authorship strengthens integrity. The self realizes that creation binds the self to time. What is created continues acting, even when the creator rests. Action extended is influence. The self sees that the creative self does not dissolve into the world. It shapes it. Shaping requires firmness. Firmness refines identity. The self learns that creation transforms isolation into contribution. Contribution dissolves meaninglessness. Meaninglessness avoided preserves vitality. The self understands that creation awakens reverence. Reverence for effort. Reverence for form. Reverence for becoming. The self realizes that the creative act is the self standing before existence and answering its call. The call is silent. The answer must be lived. The self sees that creation is the antidote to despair. Despair feeds on stagnation. Creation restores motion. The self learns that creation refines will. Will expressed repeatedly becomes character. Character embodied becomes presence. The self understands that creation deepens individuality without isolating the self. Individuality expressed honestly invites connection, not separation. The self realizes that creation requires humility. Not everything created will succeed. Failure instructs. Instruction strengthens. The self sees that creation purifies intention. Intention tested by effort reveals sincerity. The self learns that creation resists imitation. Imitation preserves comfort. Creation demands courage. The self understands that the creative self is never finished. Completion belongs to stagnation. Becoming belongs to life. The self realizes that creation aligns the self with the rhythm of existence. Existence is movement. Movement requires participation. The self sees that creation is not rebellion. It is affirmation. Affirmation that life is worth shaping. Affirmation that meaning can be embodied. The self learns that creation grants dignity. Dignity earned through contribution cannot be taken away. The self understands that the creative self does not wait for approval. Approval follows influence. Influence follows creation. The self realizes that creation prepares the self for immortality. Not biological immortality, but continuity of impact. Impact carried beyond the self. And finally, the self understands to create is to answer existence with intention. To refuse creation is to refuse one's own awakening. And the awakened self does not remain silent. It creates.